everyone, welcome to the April 21st edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona, and as usual this week we're looking ahead to some weekend racing. Keeneland on Saturday features two graded stakes races, the Elkhorn going the marathon distance on the turf, and the Ben Ally also going a long distance for the dirt routers, a mile and 3/16 for some of the older horses on the main track. It's an interesting late Pick-5 sequence surrounding those two graded stakes. We've got a pair of allowance races, one a sprint for the 3-year-old fillies. The last race is a turf sprint for older horses that looks pretty competitive with a lot of speed signed on. The sequence, though, is made pretty difficult by the first leg. It's a maiden special weight event with a ton of first-time starters. I guess it's at least kind that it's scheduled as the first leg of the sequence, so you do get to see the tote board for that race. My usual co-host, Craig Mulkowski, who usually helped me go through this sequence, he is on vacation for the next couple of podcasts, but I do have a guest joining me to handicap this Keeneland sequence, somebody that I like to have on during the Keeneland meet. Michael Domabyl, a Keeneland analyst for In the Money Media, who focuses on the turf pick 3 there. Michael, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David. You and Craig have had quite a bit of success in this last couple of weeks covering the pick 5s. I hope I can just continue the momentum with you.
Yeah, we had a few good days in March. Those are really tough to hit, so it's always gratifying when you can give out some good opinions on this podcast. You usually have a pretty good opinion yourself, so hopefully we can help some of the fans do well at Keeneland on Saturday. Before we get into the handicapping, you follow Keeneland more closely than I do. I typically am more of a Nairo-focused guy, and I'll pay attention to some of the stakes there, but I can't handicap every card day in and day out. It's such a short meet, so it's hard to really comment too much on trends that have developed. But have you noticed anything with regard to the way the track is playing, or maybe any connections that have been doing unexpectedly well at this meet?
Yeah, I think that connections are a big factor at Keeneland. And the longer I've been following it, the longer it seems that the same connections do well each year and other connections underperform. And I think there's a few horses we'll hit on during the sequence that kind of exemplify that phenomenon. But there's definitely barns that are pointing to this meet and other barns that aren't really using it as the main goal for their prospects.
For sure. I mean, I've, Brad Cox, Wesley Ward, I'm sure those are some of the typical names that you're talking about, and we've seen them have a lot of success so far at this meet, and we're going to encounter them a few times in this sequence. How do you feel about a pick 5 like this that's kicking off with a maiden special weight? I mean, it definitely makes things difficult. I'm always of two minds when I hear that old axiom, well, at least you get to see the board in this race and you can follow the live money, because, I mean, following the live money sometimes leads you to underlays, so I don't always like to take that advice. I mean, it's a good thing that you would at least get to see the board so you can make some value assessments in this first leg. You get to see how horses are being wagered on. But, I mean, that's the case in every race, not just a maiden special with a lot of first-time starters. So it's definitely difficult to have a race like this at any leg in the sequence.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes this particular maiden special weight a little bit more difficult is just the lack of visibility that we have into the workouts. Recording this ahead of time, there's not as many clocker reports out. Keeneland does a good job of posting some of the workouts on their website, but it's not like when at Saratoga where you have pretty much a full complement of XBTV workouts to view, because in my opinion, pedigree only takes you so far for these first-time starters, and really the biggest factor in terms of predicting whether these horses are going to be ready first out is their most recent workouts.
100%. It's something I like to pay a lot of attention to when I have access to that stuff. As you know, doing the morning lines up in Saratoga, ton of first-time starters, so I'm on XBTV for hours every week trying to see if I can find some talent there, and we really don't have access to that in this maiden special weight race. What I do try to do in these races, if I can, is just look up the workouts every day, and especially for some lower-profile barns that maybe don't have a lot of horses, you might sometimes be able to link up who a horse is working with if the times match up. It's a tricky thing to do, especially for a barn like Brad Cox or maybe Todd Pletcher, who have maybe 10 horses working from the gate on a given day. Well, then you can't really link up who's working with who, because you really need to see the works to be sure about that. But sometimes for the smaller stables, you can do that stuff and get a sense of maybe if you know who the horse is working with, how they think of the horse. But it's tough. There's a lot of uncertainty in this race. let's dive right into race 6, which does kick off this late Pick-5 sequence, 6.5 furlong event for the 3-year-olds maiden special weight. And, it's the kind of race, Michael, where I don't want to leave any stone unturned. So it's kind of my inclination to just go through this field in post-position order rather than jumping around. And maybe we'll just kind of assess some of these first-time starters. So the horses that are drawn down towards the inside, we've got a couple 20-1 shots, Cartographer and Gilded Kraken. Of those two, I mean, I think Cartographer, who's drawn down towards the rail, looks like the one who's got the flashier workouts for Doug O'Neill. And Doug O'Neill is a trainer that does okay with first-time starters. He doesn't have a reputation for winning at a high percentage, but when you look up his stats in Formulator, he's got a positive ROI. So that's a horse that, at a bigger price in this race, might be somewhat interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, as I was mentioning earlier, there's not much to be gleaned from the workouts, but I did go on Keeneland's website and looking, and there was positives from their clocker to say about the April 2nd work. He went solo, but did it well in hand. Like you said, positive ROI, and that's for Doug O'Neill with firsters, and that's especially true with 3-year-old and older first-time starters on dirt sprints, which is kind of a unique a place to have a positive ROI. It's a lot of times these older first-time starters, they're running up against horses with more experience. Not necessarily the case in this race, but generally speaking. So I think Cartographer is pretty dangerous at a pretty big price. And, Doug O'Neill has brought horses to Keeneland and had success. I think of B-Doc, who won a couple of races at Keeneland in 2022. So he doesn't have the best record in Kentucky overall, but that doesn't mean Keeneland is in a spot where he can target.
Yeah, and this horse is out of a dam that's a half-sister to Bustin Stones, the Grade 1 Carter winner, who's been a really strong influence as a sire of precocious types. So maybe some pedigree to be a quick one for Cartographer. Gilded Kraken goes out for Ian Wilkes, who just has that, I think, deserved reputation of not really cranking his horses to win first time out. This one seems like one that might need a race.
Yeah, I think I will let this one beat me.
Yeah, De La Calle, the number 3, maybe a little more interesting here. This one, I think he's 15-1 on the morning line. Some nice pedigree. The Dam earned $700,000. She was a Grade 2 and Grade 3 winner on the dirt. And Rusty Arnold is one of these trainers that is never going to win at a very high percentage, but he's a friendly trainer to horse players because he's got some positive ROI stats, and he can be a little sneaky with horses like this.
Yeah, I think George Arnold is Rusty Arnold, he's one of those barns that does point to Keeneland. I don't necessarily know if the horses he's pointing to Keeneland are necessarily his first-time starters on dirt sprints. He's hit at some big prices in turf routes with horses that might have, experience with a race or two. I looked at one stat that I wrote down for this horse, and Rusty Arnold's 1 for 32 with a 25-cent ROI with 3-year-old and older first-time starters in dirt sprints. So the work pattern looks okay, but didn't reach out for one of the top jocks that rides for this barn. So I'm willing to let this one beat me as well. You can't use them all in this leg.
One of the more intriguing horses in this race is the number 4, Mr. Keating, who just doesn't really have much pedigree to speak of at all. I mean, Carpe Diem is not really known as an elite sire. I looked up the Dams family, even going back a couple generations, and there's just not a whole lot to comment on. It's not a high class Mary Lou Whitney stable family here, but for some reason, they decided to nominate this horse to the Triple Crown. I do like to take note of that kind of stuff for a barn that doesn't nominate every horse to the Triple Crown. Norm Cassie has just been on a tear since the calendar turned to 2023, especially in dirt races. He's winning at a very high percentage, and reaching out to Irad Ortiz feels like there are some signs this one's live.
Yeah, that's how I view it as well, especially with Irad having potentially the option to ride Cigarette Boat, who's to the outside. And ends up here. And Norm Cassie's barn's just been on fire in dirt races in particular this year. And he's another one like Doug O'Neill with a positive ROI with that stat I've been mentioning with 3-year-old and older first time starters in dirt sprints. So it's the distant female family of Birdstone and Birdtown, but I mean you have to be reaching to say that. But you always like to see Mary Lou Whitney's stables doing well.
Yeah, and I was trying to look up some of the past workouts for this horse. That March 17th gate workout at Fairgrounds that got the bullet, I think there were just two gate workouts that day for Norm Cassie horses, and the other one went in 49. It feels like those two horses, the other one, Quick Tap, a maiden, probably worked together, and this one probably destroyed that horse, just kind of based on what I know of looking up these workouts. So feels like this one probably has some ability. We'll see if he can win on debut against this field. The number 5, Moreau, is a horse going out for a lower profile stable, a horse that does have some nice workout showing at Keeneland, some quick times, and there's a lot of pedigree here going back to the second generation, a Juddmonte bred horse. So even though there's no official purchase at auction or anything like that, probably a private purchase away from Juddmonte at some point. So some interesting things to comment on a horse that could go off at a decent price.
Yeah, this is another one that perusing the Keeneland website, there was positive notes on the April 5th work from their clocker. It's tough to take a barn like this going up against some of the more high profile operations, but I mean, you are going to be rewarded with a bigger price, and will likely probably get drift up from the 8-1 morning line. So there's things to like. But it's going to be it's not often that you see this barn win with a firster against the likes of Brad Cox and Mike Maker and Steve Asmussen. So we'll see.
Yeah, Andrew McKeever actually does have some nice stats with first-time starters, but like you said, you don't really think of that barn as winning at the Keeneland meet in a high-profile race like this. The number 6 is Billy Jack, and one of the few horses with experience in this race, and I think a horse that you really have to develop an opinion about because he's really the only horse with experience that a lot of people would be likely to use it here. What did you make of that debut at Fairgrounds? Because it felt to me like he was the less heralded of two Steve Asmussen horses and maybe was deferring a little bit to his stablemate in the early stages of that race, but still showed some ability.
Yeah, I think he showed a good amount of ability. That race came back decently fast for a maiden race. I do think that the question with him is not necessarily as much about him as an individual for me as it is about Steve Asmussen's barn in general at Keeneland. I mean, Keeneland's been a house of horrors for his barn over the past 2 years. He's hitting at 5% with a 37-cent ROI. This year, he's 0 for 14 on the dirt with only 5 hitting the board. And all but one of those horses were under 10-1, like this horse is likely to be. So despite the fact that he does have experience, I think that the short comment actually is probably a little bit overstates the trouble he had in the stretch. So maybe people will lean on him a little bit more because of that, but I don't think that was much. I'm willing to fade him a bit just because of how Asmussen's barn's been going at Keeneland recently.
Yeah, those are some pretty compelling stats if you're going to be scared away from this horse. No, I agree. The trouble line first time out, I mean, it did affect him slightly, but I didn't really feel like it cost him that much in the running of the race. He had his chance to get into the clear in the stretch and just kind of stayed on at one pace. He seemed like a solid race overall, and he does have a right to do better. So we'll see what we get from him. Couple of interesting first-time starters drawn to his outside, particularly the number 7 Class Actor going out for the Brad Cox stable. This one is a half to a horse named Classy Act, who is grade 2 placed going longer by Go Sapper. Not going to be any kind of surprise when this horse is a runner.
Yeah, I would agree. I think this is probably likely going to be your favorite. And Brad Cox, while overall hasn't done great with that stat I've been mentioning, older first-time starters in dirt sprints, at Keeneland particularly, he does a lot better. He's 5 for 15, 33% with a 285 ROI. This horse has been working with, in his last work, with Mo Strike, who was the Saratoga Special winner last year. Is that right?
Sanford winner, I believe.
Sanford winner, gotcha. I does seem from the clocker notes on the Keeneland website that Mo Strike has been working a little bit better than him. In the work 3 back, he worked with Double Barrel, who actually kind of bombed at Horseshoe Indianapolis in his first time out. So it's this could be a Brad Cox that you're willing to oppose. It's just tough when the barn's as hot as it's been. This barn, Brad Cox has done really well with these owners in particular. I think this is the ownership group that produced Loggins and Giant Mischief. So those 2-year-old purchases those debut runners with this owner trainer combination have been pretty potent.
Yeah, I saw that same thing with Mo Strike, though I didn't note the Keeneland notes on that horse. Yeah, very, very interesting runner. Probably not going to get much price on him. The number 8 is Solevo. This one cost a lot of money at the 2-year-old sale, $685,000 after working a furlong in 10-1. Not really a pedigree that says to me win early in sprinting. Cherie DeVaux hasn't had a lot of recent success with first-time starters, so over the past 5 years, she's done okay with that move. This is one that I was kind of on the fence about.
Yeah, I think whenever you see a flashy work at the OBS sale, it's I don't think what the buyer is looking for is to debut 12 months later. So I do think that that's a slight negative, that it took him this long to get to the races. And for Cherie DeVaux, she does win sometimes with first-time starters, but when that's more often with 2-year-old first-time starters. Once they get older, the stats dip off quite a bit. I think for me, I like the namesake of this horse, the restaurant in Saratoga, a little more than his chances in this particular race.
Yeah, I'm just not the biggest fan of the City of Lights on the dirt in general. Moving to the outside, we've got 4 big prices drawn in posts 9 through 12. Anything to comment about these horses? A little bit less pedigree here, some connections that you wouldn't really think of as winning with the firsters among those, and those that have experience are just going to have to improve.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll note on the 9 5-star G-Man is that these connections, the same owner-trainer teamed up to win a maiden special weight at Keeneland at 20-1 in 2020. That was the only first-time starter that this barn has won on the dirt with in the past 5 years. So it would just be a weird coincidence of history repeating itself if that horse could get to the winner's circle. I actually made the number 11 Cigarette Boat my top pick in the race, and I think there's the reason being is that I'm not really enthralled with any of the first time starters, and Billy Jack I'm against due to the fact that I think the Asmussen barn has been really underperforming at the meet, and Maker and Gaffleone have been hitting on all cylinders at the meet. So I know he didn't necessarily do much running in the synthetic start, but he did take a step forward on his speed figures from 2 to 3. So if none of these firsters are really anything special, and Asmussen barn still is underperforming, even if Cigarette Boat runs back to the speed figure that he got on synthetic, that makes him a player here. And the other factor is that Maker is one of those barns that does point to Keeneland. Maiden dirt sprints at Keeneland. He's 8 for 41 with a 228 ROI. So I think, if I'm trying to find what I can latch onto in this race, it's that these runners have experience, but I'm picking the one that's going to be less fancied.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think it's my inclination and probably the inclination of a lot of players to assume that this is going to be a high-quality race with all of these sexy-looking first-time starters. And a horse like this, you just assume that it might not have the natural ability to win, but sometimes these races don't turn out to be as strong as they might look on paper. We don't know a whole lot about these debut runners, so maybe it's not going to come up that fast, and that definitely brings a horse like Cigarette Boat into the mix. So just kind of to recap, now that we've gone through the handicapping portion, obviously I know you're using Cigarette Boat. Among the firsters, who would you have your eye on to proceed forward in this sequence?
Yeah, I'm looking at Cigarette Boat and Cartographer, the number 1, as my primary uses. I think Class Actor is worth including just because of how well the Brad Cox barn has been going, and linking up with that ownership group has been profitable. And then Mr. Keating as well. I think that firster is probably the 4 and the 7 are the 2 live firsters in my opinion, and the number 1 Cartographer.
Yeah, we're on similar pages here. I just didn't want to take a big stand in this race. I probably will use Billy Jack as a backup in here, although I'm a little bit scared off by some of those stats that you mentioned. I'd throw in De La Cal, the 3, the Rusty Arnold horse, but definitely a race where I want to have some coverage moving ahead to the last 4 legs of this sequence. Let's move on to race 7. Smaller field here, a little bit less going on. An N2L allowance race going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies. And I think we're going to have a clearly defined favorite in this one in the number 7, Socially Selective. This was a horse that won at a nice price last summer at Saratoga, kind of a well-kept secret for the Bill Mott barn. Looked great that day. Did miss the rest of her 2-year-old season, but came back in March at Oaklawn. Was second to a very good horse in the Purple Martin, that being Key of Life, who did come back at this Keeneland meet to win the Beaumont recently with a nice speed figure. So just dropping in class, socially selective, she seems like a legitimate favorite, would you say?
Yeah, I think this is the place where a lot of people will be singling in the Pick-5. I think this is the place where I will be singling in the Pick-5 with the number 7 socially selective. This sequence in particular, I think you have to be careful about leaning on combos with horses like this too heavily, just because of how overly used they're going to be in terms of people's combos in the sequence. But I really think that there's just too many signals pointing in this horse's direction. Like you said, she had a sparkling debut at Saratoga, and then ran into Key of Life last time out, who is a really nice horse for Brad Cox. Improved her speed figure 9 points when winning the Beaumont. I think the thing that's the biggest positive for her is that she's drawn outside as well, so she can sit right off of the other speed and likely pounce in the lane, kind of get that 3 wide stalking trip that a lot of Bill Mott horses run really well with. I think she's very likely to win, and I don't see too much reason to try to put any money in opposing her.
Yeah, I went back and watched that return to Oaklawn, trying to find some vulnerability there, and she tried really hard. I mean, she clearly did not possess as much natural ability as the winner, Key of Life, who, as we said, is a really nice horse. But, I mean, she could have thrown in the towel and, finished worse than second in that race, and she just kept trying through the wires. So I thought it was a likable effort, and she could move forward off that second off. But like you said, this is a place where a lot of people are going to single, and I always try to keep an open mind in these races and just maybe try to find somebody else that, might be able to create some additional value even higher than their win price in a sequence like this, because in races where a lot of people are going to single socially selective, maybe she's even money on the tote board, but she could be 3 to 5 in the Pick-5. So that just creates value in other horses. So I want to keep an open mind about them. I mean, I guess the logical other horse that some people might use is the number 2 Unsung Melody, who's okay. She's got a lot of early speed, was run down by Punch Bowl 2 back, who is one of the players moving on towards the Kentucky Oaks, if she can get in that race for the Brad Cox stable. I wouldn't say that I loved her maiden win. It was okay. I guess she was flattered by the horse that won, who was second, one back, finishing second behind her. I just, Michael, while I haven't necessarily seen strong biases developing at this Keeneland meet, I will say I haven't been noticing myself a ton of gate-to-wire winners or horses kind of riding the rail, showing a ton of speed to victory. Maybe that's just my perception and you disagree. So I didn't want to get too interested in Unsung Melody and maybe instead look at some prices in this race if I was going to use anybody else.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's leading me against Unsung Melody is going back to what I was mentioning earlier about how connections really do play to their historical trends at Keeneland. And the Ortiz barn, this is kind of a negative circuit switch for him. He does better at Oaklawn than he does a lot of other places. And so I think that in and of itself makes it a little bit tough to take a horse that's going to have a similar running style as the favorite, put that one away. And if they don't go too fast, hold off other horses. So that was one of the reasons why I was against Unsung Melody, just because it's going to be tough to from the inside, gunning from the inside to hold off all the others.
Yeah, one of the hot barns that I guess could pull in some support in this race is the number 4 Devious Stairs, going out for Wesley Ward. This horse debuted on New Year's Day at Turfway on the Tapeta surface and looked good in that victory. I don't think she was beating much, but she's the kind of horse when I watch win on synth, says to me at least, probably not a turf horse, probably more of a dirt horse. So I think that this move to dirt next time out for Wesley Ward makes some sense. And the fact that she's resurfacing at Keeneland might speak of some intention.
Yeah, I think this is probably the most likely upsetter versus the number 2 Unsung Melody, just because of how hot the Ward barn is. I'm not necessarily sure if, like you mentioned, the maiden race, that wasn't necessarily the strongest field. This is a huge step up in class. But it was a big field that she beat, and she didn't do it in the normal Wesley Ward fashion of just blitzing the field. She was able to stalk and pound. So potentially if the 2 and the 7 battle it up early on, that this one could pick up the pieces.
Yeah, watching that race, she's a big, robust horse who didn't even look to me fully fit in that race. And she kind of has this awkward action to her where her legs kind of move in multiple directions. The way she moves kind of reminds me of that really good Chad Brown filly Guarana from a number of years ago. Not that she's nearly in that league, but I mean, something that might have been playing with her action in that race is when you watch that Turfway race, her girth strap had come undone at some point in the race, and it was kind of very unusually long and like flapping around between her legs in the stretch. So just something to note when you watch that replay. But she's going to have to take a step forward, but she certainly can for a dangerous barn. And the one other horse that I want to mention in this race, who's going to be a bigger price, is the number 6 Frosciato, going out for Owen Hardy barn. Wasn't facing particularly good horses at Tampa Bay Downs over the winter, but she's getting a big rider upgrade for this race from the Apprentice to Tyler Gaffalione. And I think that's important to note when you have a horse who kind of got an just a ride that lacked seasoning, let's say, last time out, when this horse broke slowly from the gate and then made this big middle move, maybe an overconfident move to rush up the challenge for the lead around the far turn before getting a little tired. I think that there's more ability here than the speed figures would suggest on this horse. I just don't know if she's going to be good enough to upset Socially Selective, but at the price, she'd be the one that I'd be more likely to upgrade than the other two we just talked about.
Yeah, she's interesting. I wonder if shorter is going to be better for her, though. I don't know, being by Frosted out of Ashado, who obviously won the Breeders' Cup Distaff. I don't know if that's going to be better for her. She's kind of runs a little bit, still like she needs some more seasoning, so to speak. So I wonder if that's going to mean she's better going longer than shorter. What do you take that view, or do you think that shortening back up to 6 is going to be okay?
I mean, Ashado, as you said, she was best going 1 1/8, grade 1 Breeders' Cup winner, but a lot of her foals have been better going shorter. She produced a horse named Westwood, her best foal, who was a pure sprinter, I think got a 105 buyer going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt, a really fast horse. So maybe she just imparts more speed to her progeny. We'll see. I mean, obviously Ashado has not been as good a producer as she was a race mare, let's say. So we'll see what Frosciato can do here, but I agree she's going to have to take a step forward, and we'll see if she can do it going the 6 furlong distance. Let's move on to the stakes portion of this sequence. The grade 2 Elkhorn is right in the middle of this Pick-5, going the 1.5 mile distance on the turf for the older horses. And this is a really fun race. 10 horses signed on. I think contention runs pretty deep in here. No big surprise that Mike Maker has a strong hand, with a couple of runners in here that are, I think, the first and second favorites on the morning line. And these are two horses in Red Knight and Value Engineering that I have respect for. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be value in this race, but I think that each of them come in with solid form and they're proven at this distance. So I can't knock either one of these Mike Maker trainees too much.
Yeah, I think that those two are definitely the horses to beat. They both notched wins in those Gulfstream Park Marathon turf races in their most recent starts. It's just at what point do you start to think that a new face has got to emerge in this division? I mean, Channel Maker, Red Knight, especially, at being 9-year-olds, they're kind of like that mayor of the town that's been the mayor for a long time, and it's nice to see them still be out there and doing their best work, but maybe some fresh blood in this division isn't the worst thing.
Yeah, the term limits have not come into effect for Red Knight and Channel Maker just yet in their 9-year-old seasons. And Red Knight in particular, I mean, such a neat horse who feels like he'll go off form, but then he always comes back and he's better than ever. So just a really neat horse, and they're easy to root for. But I agree with you. I don't think that they necessarily have to win this race. I do want to talk a little bit about some of those Gulfstream races that they come out of. I thought Red Knight got just a fantastic ride from Irad Ortiz to win the McKnight, and I actually preferred Value Engineering out of that race a little bit because he sort of made the early move that set it up for Red Knight to follow him, and then he came back and won the Mac d'Armagnac, and I thought showed some real grit and victory that day. Of the two, if Value Engineering is the bigger price, I kind of would rather use him as opposed to Red Knight. And also Red Knight is losing Irad Ortiz, who has landed elsewhere in this race, and getting back her Gerardo Corrales, who is a fine rider, but I mean, any switch away from Irad Ortiz in one of these mile-and-a-half turf races is probably not a positive one. So just trying to keep that in mind. The other old timer in here is Channel Maker. And I mean, again, another easy horse to root for, but it does kind of feel like he's on the other side of the hill at this point.
Yeah, I think Channel Maker, the biggest factor that he's going to have in the race is what type of ride does he get. I think from the inside post, especially with the turn that comes up relatively quickly, that's going to be an important few strides in general in the race, not necessarily only for his chances, but for the chances of some others in the race. He obviously, when he's at his best, he's really close to the pace. Now, he hasn't necessarily shown that same type of enthusiasm breaking from the gate as he did earlier in his career, but he can be a thorn in the side of horses like Rising Empire or anyone else who wants to get forward early.
Yeah, I mean, Channel Maker does not have that much natural speed. I mean, you kind of see it when they turn him back in distance to races going a mile and a quarter or less. I mean, he can't even get near the lead in those races. But in these mile-and-a-half races that are run at a slower clip, when he gets those aggressive rides that you're talking about, he can get forward. And when he gets forward, that's when he tends to get brave in these races, especially when they're run at moderate, steady paces. So that can make him dangerous. And we saw how dangerous he can be in this Elkhorn last year when he won off the layoff and battled on gamely to win. This feels like a tougher edition of the Elkhorn than the one that he won last year, so I think he might have to raise his game a little bit from his recent form to be effective here, but you discount Channel Maker at your own risk because he's a really nice horse who will pop up with a big performance every now and then. You know, Michael, we'll get to our horses that we like, right? The horses that I think we like in just a little bit. But before we do, I just want to say the horse that I'd be playing against in this race, who often takes a lot of money, is the number 8 Highest Honors. This is just a horse that I've never been a big fan of, especially not on the turf. I know that he's had a few trips and he typically gets pieces of his races, but for the Chad Brown stable, with Irad Ortiz aboard, especially with Irad Ortiz getting off Red Knight and riding this horse, I just feel like it's going to drive down the price on Highest Honors even more. And to me, this horse just lacks the turn of foot and finishing speed to be winning these graded stakes races.
Yeah, I think that whenever Highest Honors does win one of these marathon stakes races, it's not going to be with my money. I'm worried that it could, I mean, it could happen. He's been very close to getting it done in a lot of these races, but I just don't think that the value is ever going to be there on this horse with the connections that are associated with him. Like you mentioned, Irad being on this horse signals that people are going to be following his decision and moving their money to Highest Honors versus Red Knight. And I just don't think that he possesses any sort of edge on the rest of the field.
Where were you looking to go in this race if we're against some of these proven old-timer types?
Well, there's two horses in this race that I think, are the fresh face that people can look to. At this point, the Channel Makers, the Value Engineerings, the Red Knights of the world, they're always going to be in that 2-1 to 5-1 range, and eventually they're going to get their luck is going to run out. And when it does, hopefully I can get between 6 and 12-1 on the horse that ends up surpassing them in this division. So one of the horses I want to use is the number 7 House Street. I know that this is kind of the flashy new object in a race where there's a lot of old timers running, but I do think that more distance is better for this horse, and you can kind of see it based on his last race, where I know it was only 1 mile and 3/8 on paper, but this horse has already run 1.5 miles because he was 4 wide the entire way and just still finishing so strongly through the lane. I know that field was not as good as this one, but the 4th place finisher came back to win an allowance at Keeneland, improving his TimeformUS speed figure by 14 points. And so, I think this is just a logical next step for this horse to start to challenge the old guard in this division. So I know I cheated a little bit and watched your preview for this race on the DRF's YouTube channel, and I know you're very much opposed to House Street, but that's just where I've landed as one of the two options for me in this race.
Well, I'll say this. I'm not opposed to your take on this horse, that he has a lot of upside and he might be pretty talented. I actually agree with that. I mean, he showed it in his debut on Wood Memorial Day in 2022 when he was finishing like a freight train in a 1 mile race that didn't feature a whole lot of pace, and he's definitely improved with the added distance. I agree with everything you said about his N1X victory last time at Gulfstream. He was so much the best that day, and the way that he was just extending his stride through the wire was pretty impressive. I guess my issue with House Street is, well, there are two things. I was looking up some stats for trainer Jorge Abreu, and this one, like, absolutely floored me. In graded stakes races over the past 5 years, he's 0 for 56. And I just couldn't believe that. I feel like Jorge Abreu has had a lot of talented horses in his barn, and to have it never won a graded stakes race just was really surprising to me. He has had 15 finish in the money, so they've been around there, but it hasn't quite got it done yet, so House Street would be the first. That's just maybe something to overcome. And the other thing is, Michael, he's 10-1 on the morning line. I just feel like watching Keeneland day in and day out, or over the past few years, horses like this, they got this sexy look to them. They're the new face in a field where we're kind of tired of a lot of horses. That I feel like they tend to get overbet a little bit. So I wonder what kind of price he's really going to be with Flavien Prat aboard. I don't think he's going to go favored or anything like that, but I doubt we're getting 10-1 on this horse. So I agree with your points about him in terms of the handicapping the race. I think he's a really interesting horse. I just didn't necessarily see the value there, or at least based on the way that I'm expecting the race to be bet. I wanted to kind of veer in a different direction, do a new face, at least a new face at this marathon distance, and that's the number 3 Rising Empire. And this is a horse that I've kind of been waiting to go a long distance for a very long time. I was sort of a fan of his when he was competing on the dirt early in his career, but he just kind of hit a plateau in his form and wasn't really progressing. So they switched him to turf this winter at Fairgrounds, and he's really taken his game to the next level. He was a very good second place finisher in the Muniz Memorial Classic last time behind Spooky Channel, who is a very nice horse who would be a major player if he were running in this race. And Rising Empire cut out some legitimate fractions that day before getting past at the end, but it's not like he threw in the towel. He was really battling back once challenged by Spooky Channel in the stretch, and he just seems like a horse that is really meant to go these longer distances. By Empire Maker, he's a half-brother to Rocketry, who was a specialist going distances of 1.5 miles and even beyond 1.5 miles, and a horse that could go long on the dirt and the turf, just had a ton of stamina. And Rising Empire showed off a new running style last time, going to the front end, and to me, he might just possess a little more sharpness than a runner like Channel Maker, and being drawn outside of that foe, I think gives him a slight advantage with that quick run into the first turn. So I like Rising Empire in this spot. He's another one that I don't know if we're going to get 6-1 on him, because I think he has a little more appeal than that. But I view him as one of the more likely winners of this race.
Are you concerned at all with Rising Empire about transitioning his form from Fairgrounds back to Keeneland? I know that the Fairgrounds turf course, I wouldn't call it to the extent that what the Churchill turf course went through last year, but it had been playing a little bit quirky during that meet, where some horses really were relishing it and others weren't. Is that at all a concern, or is the fact that you're going to get between 4 to 6 to 8-1 on him, enough to look past that?
I guess that's a minor concern if you have a concern about anything with this horse. What I will say is that gives me a little more confidence is that at least he used a variety of running styles over that Fairgrounds course, whereas you think of horses closing down the center of the racetrack or riding a specific path as being most successful. And if you watch his 3 races there, he ran 3 different kinds of races. Making that stand side move 3 back, making an earlier move 2 back, and then last time going to the front end and riding the rail. So, I mean, he showed versatility over a course that was playing one way for a lot of the meet. So I'm hoping that it's not going to be a problem.
Yeah, I think that's probably the root of our differences in this race. Is I think I'm going to be taking the opinion that the Fairgrounds turf races are not super indicative of what future success for these horses is going to be. and which landed me on the crazy top pick that I might get me kicked off of coming back on this podcast ever again. But because you covered 8 horses in your preview for DRF's YouTube channel, but you didn't cover the number 10, Tiz the Bomb. And so I'm going to make a crazy case that this horse is going to be better going longer and is now just rounding into form. So I think obviously he's shown talent throughout his career. If you bet on him in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, you actually got paid out. So that's always going to be one of his lasting legacies. But after kind of trying a lot of different things in 2022, getting on the Derby trail, obviously that didn't work out. But he did have some races during that year where he ran pretty good speed figures. Case in point would be the Jeff Ruby Stakes, albeit over synthetic track, but that was a pretty live race and it got a pretty fast speed figure. I don't think he took to the fairgrounds turf at all. I'm willing to say that turf course did not suit this horse. He just ran too bad to be believed in both of his fairground starts. And when he got to Keeneland, I think there's a lot to like about the race he ran at the beginning of the meet. One, he ran into a horse, Hurricane Dream, who I actually think is going to be a player in the turf division moving forward, who blitzed that field. But he had some distinct trouble down the stretch that probably prevented him from getting second. But the thing that really makes me think that this horse has rounded back into form is the fact that speed figure had to be downgraded on TimeformUS because of the pace. But if you kind of take it at its raw value, that's right back in line with what he was running in the Jeff Ruby Stakes last year. So now stretching out to 1.5 miles is a little bit of a question, but drawing the outside post, I think, forces the hand of Brian Hernandez to try to get forward, get his position in the second or third, right behind Channel Maker and Rising Empire. And the Dam one going 10 furlongs on the turf. I know Hit It a Bomb is not the greatest stamina influence, but if I'm going to take a horse going 12 furlongs for the first time, I want to get 10 to 12 to 1 on it. I think Tiz the Bomb will be all of that.
You see, when you said you had an opinion that I was not going to like, I thought you were talking about House Street. I didn't see the Tiz the Bomb tout coming, but, look, I'm never going to talk anybody off a horse that's going to be a gigantic price, and he's going to be a gigantic price in this race. I'll just say I didn't have the same interest in him, but you make some interesting points about his recent form. If you can make excuses for any horse that's going to be a big price, that gives you an edge. So, I'll say I wish you luck with Tiz the Bomb. I don't quite see it, but if you're right about him, you're going to look pretty clever after this race.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where the horse has always been highly thought of. And if he was turning back and going down the hill 6.5 furlongs, I might be able to make the same case, but it's something new. I don't know if they've quite figured out what this horse wants to do. And so trying something new, maybe this will be it.
Let's move on to the 9th race, the other graded stakes that's part of this card, the Ben Ally Grade 3 event, going 1 mile and 3/16 on the dirt course. And pretty solid race for a Grade 3 event. We've got some nice horses in here, some 4-year-olds that ran in some big races last year. Among them is the likely favorite, the number 4, Skippy Longstocking. A horse that has run some big speed figures on occasion. I can't say that I really think of him as being in the upper echelon of the handicap division, but this is not a Grade 1 or Grade 2 race. I think he's probably running where he belongs. I will say that it is a tougher field, at least I think, than the one that he defeated in the Challenger last time. So I do believe he's going to have to run a little better than he did in that race. And I just have some overall problems with some of the circumstances under which he's run his fastest speed figures. Obviously over that sloppy track in the West Virginia Derby, and then 3 back when he won the Harlan's Holiday at Gulfstream. That's a race that I just have some problems with the timing of, and the speed figure that anybody's given out to that race. They just all seem very high. So I view Skippy Longstocking as being somewhat vulnerable here, though obviously acknowledging he can win.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with Skippy Longstocking for me is just in the context of the Pick-5 sequence. Obviously, he can win, but I'm of the opinion that Socially Selective is a very likely winner in the race 2 back. So I can't be using both Skippy Longstocking and Socially Selective on any of my combinations. So it's almost by default that I have to be against Skippy Longstocking, because you can't be leaning on both of those two horses in this sequence and expect to extract any value. And I think the other case against him is what I talked about with a couple runners, where it's kind of a negative circuit switch, right? Safi Joseph makes South Florida and even Tampa his own personal playground, but coming to Keeneland, it's a little bit different story. And so I think he has shown that he's been able to take his game on the road. But do you really want to swallow a short price on a horse having to do it again?
No, I think that's a fair point. What I will say, I agree with you about trying to extract value from this sequence. And I think you have to do it based on your opinion. So I'll personally grant you permission to use Socially Selective and Skippy Longstocking on your ticket that uses Tiz the Bomb, because I think Tiz the Bomb is going to generate enough value in this entire sequence that I wouldn't want to see you get knocked out by Skippy Longstocking, who obviously can win this race. But no, I agree with all the points you're making. He's another horse that might be negative value in a Pick-5 sequence, because he just has those hallmarks of being one that a lot of people might lean on in this sequence. And furthermore, this is a race that does not feature a ton of pace. I think the three horses that do have speed are all drawn in the three post positions closest to the rail. So it's going to be a rider's race where they can all see each other and maybe jockey for position into that first turn. And I guess the positive with Skippy Longstocking is he has that running style where he kind of can make his own good trip. He can stalk, sit outside of those horses. Irad Ortiz is great at working out trips on horses. So, I mean, there are definitely things to like about him. I just kind of viewed him as maybe one that would offer negative value in here. Who were you looking at as maybe an alternative to that horse?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to go. I think Rattle and Roll is kind of the logical alternative, kind of similar to the other Kenny McPeak trainee, Tiz the Bomb, that I highlighted in the last race. Always kind of shown talent, won the Breeders' Futurity over this course and distance, or over this course in his 2-year-old year. And this is, a logical time for him to take a step forward, second off the layup as a 4-year-old. I think it is a concern that he's coming off Lasix, but in the Breeders' Futurity, he ran without them. So potentially willing to look past that and include. It's just a race where I don't really have a strong opinion on anyone. I think where I'll ultimately land as my top pick is the number 7 Tawny Port, just because of the fact that he ran pretty fast races as a 3-year-old, and now he's liable to take a step forward, similar to what Rattle and Roll is eligible to do. I think the blinkers on is going to be an interesting change for Brad Cox, who actually has decent numbers with that move, albeit even in graded stakes races. I think it's funny because I was kind of against Tawny Port when I came on the podcast last year, and he made me look foolish winning the Lexington so easily. So I think that having that affinity for Keeneland already established is going to be a feather in his cap as well.
Yeah, I think when I'm going against Skippy Longstocking in this race, I'm looking at horses coming out of 2 races in particular that are of interest to me, and those are the New Orleans Classic and the Essex Stakes at Oaklawn. And I think both of those were really strong races for the level. I would say tougher than some of the races that Skippy Longstocking is coming out of. I mean, the New Orleans Classic might have been just as tough as the Pegasus World Cup, to be honest, even though the latter is a Grade 1 event. And, Rattle and Roll ran fine in that New Orleans Classic. I mean, he was kind of picking up pieces at the end of the race, but at least he was running at the end. That was in an event that was just dominated by West Willpower, who looks like he might be one of the best older horses in the country right now. I do have that concern that you mentioned about him coming off Lasix. It's something that I've mentioned a few times on the stuff that I do, that Ken McPeak just has really poor numbers with horses coming off Lasix in these stakes races. But Rattle and Roll is a horse, as you said, who's run fine without it in the past. Viewing the race through that lens, kind of wanting somebody that's coming out of one of those 2 races, I just find myself gravitating more towards the horses coming out of the Essex at Oaklawn, because I feel like they're maybe a little under the radar. And also that was a race that, didn't feature much pace, was sort of dominated towards the front end, and there are a couple of horses in here that were out the back door early that I think maybe did not get ideal trips. Now, Tawny Port is a horse that I agree with you. I think he's very interesting in this race, and he's one that doesn't have a whole lot of early speed, so it wasn't a big surprise that he was far back in the early stages of that Essex, but I do think that the mile and a 16th these days might be a little bit on the short side for him, especially in a race that doesn't feature a lot of pace, because he's kind of a grinding type that needs to work his way into his races. And when I watched that Essex, he was just hitting his best stride out in the center of the track at the very end of that race and was actually, really moving across the wire like a horse that maybe was capable of a little better or finished the race with something left in the tank. Now they're putting blinkers on, which says to me that Brad Cox saw that same thing and just wants to get this horse more engaged. And as you said, Brad Cox has been super dangerous at Keeneland. If you look up his stats specifically with Flavien Prat, everywhere over the past 5 years, they just win at a terrifying clip. 40% with a really healthy ROI. So feels like this horse is pretty live in here. I don't think he's going to be 8-1, but I think he's the kind of horse that's supposed to be 9-2, and that's a very fair price on Tawny Port. So I'm definitely using him. And the other horse that I like a little bit that is probably a crazier one to use is the other horse coming out of the Essex, the number 3, Call Me Fast. And he's just one that got the wrong trip that day. He was in the back of the pack along with Tawny Port, but that's not where he wants to be. He's more of a speed horse, and he was so far back in that race because he just broke about a length slowly and was shuffled back in the early stages, so just out of position the entire way. He's a horse that had shown good early speed in his prior two turn attempts at Oaklawn Park, winning both of them. I thought showing some real grit when he won that allowance race 2 back. And the other thing I want to note about Call Me Fast is he's a horse that showed a real affinity for Keeneland last year. Both of his races at Keeneland were huge improvements on his prior form. So maybe he's just a horse that's going to take another step forward getting back to this circuit. And he's drawn well outside of those other 2 speeds. So, Julien Leparoux, who I know doesn't have a reputation for being the most aggressive rider, but at least he's going to have some options here. So, he's going to have to improve a little bit to beat this field, but he's going to also be the biggest price in this race. And I think his form is somewhat dirtied up.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting case. I couldn't get to Call Me Fast, but I think the fact that there isn't that much speed on paper opens it up to horses like him and even the number 2 Trademark. If one of them gets aggressive early and is able to establish a nice rhythm on the front end, then they can be very dangerous. This is probably the race within the sequence where I had the toughest time forming an opinion. Just because Skippy Long Stockings gonna be tough to beat, and the others don't really do much for you. And in races like that, it sometimes happens where a wild card comes up and wins it at a big price. So I don't fault you at all for trying to make a case for Call Me Fast.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. I think this field is more evenly matched than the tote board is going to suggest. So that's I just want to keep an open mind to some of those bigger priced runners. Let's move on to the last leg of the sequence, race 10. It is a high-level allowance race, $130,000 purse, going the 5.5 furlong distance on the turf. And I was a little surprised that this race didn't quite meet the threshold to get that fast pace flag in TimeformUS, because it does feel like there is a lot of speed signed on in here, and it's kind of the rare race that doesn't feature that many closing types to complement that early speed. It's tough to know exactly how it's going to be run in terms of a dynamic standpoint and how some of the riders are going to adapt. Where do you want to start the conversation, Michael? Because it's hard to know, who's really the horse to beat in this race.
Yeah, I'll start the conversation by just giving my 2 cents on where I think the betting might be going. I don't think that Just Might is going to be the favorite in this race. If he is, then I want no part of him. But really, if he's anywhere under 10-1, I probably don't want any part of him. I think Michelle Lovell's barn has really cooled off in the past 6 months or so. This runner's kind of getting up there in age as well. He's an admirable sort. He runs well on both surfaces, but I haven't seen much in his recent form that would make him anywhere close to one of the favorites in this spot. So I do think the horse to beat is the number 3 Beer Can Man. Just because of the fact that Phil D'Amato has meant business when he's brought horses to Keeneland. This meet, and even going back a little further, I pulled a stat when it looked like Amy C was going to run in Giants Causeway last week that Phil D'Amato is 5 for 21 with a 314 ROI in turf races at Keeneland over the last 5 years. And that sample even includes 4 hopeless long shots that ran in Breeders' Cup races. So, I mean, he's 2 for 2, or as the time I pulled these past performances, he was 2 for 2 at the meet. And I think that, if you're going to take a horse that hasn't been showing a recent race that would beat this field just because he's been he's coming off a long layoff, I would want it to be from a barn that I know does well with this move. He also has good numbers with horses coming off layoffs and turf sprints as well.
Yeah, I agree. Beer Can Man looks like he's here for a reason. I mean, there's just no reason to ship a horse like this across the country for this race. I mean, I know Phil D'Amato took other horses to Keeneland, so this one probably was just on the plane. But I mean, why this horse to come off the layoff in a race at Keeneland that is going to draw a full field? It's going to be a tough spot when there probably would have been an easier option out in Southern California. I mean, this horse has been training through the winter at Los Alamitos. I mean, to pluck this horse from that situation off a 14-month layoff and bring him back at Keeneland, it does probably signal that he's well meant in this spot, and with Flavien Prat getting aboard, it just feels like further evidence. And I mean, he was a good horse when he was last competing. I know it was a long time ago, but I mean, I thought he showed some good versatility in those turf races. He handled a variety of types of turf courses and different running styles. So he looks legitimate to me, and I won't be surprised when he ultimately goes favorite in this race, and I kind of think he's supposed to be the favorite, so I'm not against him. The other horse that I think is very interesting, again, not at a big price, but just logical, is the horse that's drawn right to his inside. That's the number 2 Smokin' Jay, going out for the Kelsey Danner barn, and a horse that when he's won races, it's usually when the public is not with him. He tends to win at bigger prices, so maybe last time was the time to have it, and this time is the time to go against. But it just feels like he might have come back off the layoff last time, a different horse. That win at Gulfstream, it was his first start as a new gelding, which I think you do want to note when horses suddenly show a lot more ability or professionalism in races, and I saw that from him. I mean, he was getting a strong pace to close into, seemingly, but I mean, he just traveled so well around the turn, and once he moved out into the top of the stretch, I mean, you could see Tyler Gaffalione knew that he was going to win the race, even though he was 3 lengths off the lead at that point, and he just inhaled the leaders, really finishing powerfully. Feels like a horse that's going to get even better going the 5.5 furlong distance as opposed to the flat 5 furlong. So with a lot of speed drawn into this race, he feels like the best closing option.
Yeah, I think I was a little bit against the Smokin' Jay. A couple of the points that you mentioned a little bit in your analysis is kind of the things that I'm latching on to. I think it was a pretty perfect trip last time at Gulfstream, and I just think that 9-1 last time against a much weaker field, probably getting closer to 9-2 this time against a tougher field. And then the other thing is, I've mentioned it a few times. It's kind of an angle that I've been harping on during the Keeneland meet. It's Kelsey Danner does a lot better at Gulfstream than she does at Keeneland. She's got a positive ROI on the turf at Gulfstream Park over the past 5 years, and at Keeneland she's 0 for 15 on the Keeneland turf. So with only one in the money, so that's another factor as well. I know that Smokin' Jay has been able to take his form elsewhere, but at a shortish price, I'm willing to leave him off my tickets.
No, I don't want to suggest the wrong thing. I wasn't saying that he had any adversity to overcome last time. I just really liked the visual of the way that he was moving through the stretch of that race. But you're completely right. He got an absolutely perfect trip, great pace setup. So sometimes it's the wrong move to latch on to horses like that after they paid $20 in their prior start. So we talked about some of the short prices. Anybody else interest you in this race? Maybe that's going to offer a bit more value.
Yeah, I think so. I think Beer Can Man is going to be heavily used on a lot of my tickets just because of a lot of what we mentioned. The last thing, just to put a bow on him, the last thing I'll mention is that I think the fact that he's never gone the 5.5 is kind of interesting. I mean, I think he's kind of a tweener in California where they run either the 5.5, the flat 5s, or they run 6.5 either down the hill or off the straightaway. And I think that this 5.5 is probably another reason why Phil D'Amato put him on the plane. I think that's something that'll be useful to him. But the other horse that I want to use, maybe not in equal strength, but pretty close to, is the number 6, the creatively named Gelding No Balls. I think he's only run. He hasn't really run many turf sprints, and I think that's what this runner wants to do. You get a high percentage barn with Ravelli, and when he teams up with Gerardo Corrales, that means business. And I think there's a chance that he can be sent. And sometimes when horses get in these turf sprints, get to the lead, that they don't look back. And I know there's no red pace flag on the TimeformUS pace projector. You could argue that there might be able to be one, but even in those situations, sometimes the horse that gets to the front early is able to hold on late.
Yeah, I guess my one problem with a horse like him is just the presence of number 11, Nobody Listens, who is extremely fast in the early going and arguably more of a dirt horse, and perhaps getting up back on the turf is going to dull his early speed a little bit, because I think he's shown more speed on the dirt and on the synthetic. But I just saw a lot of speed in this race, and no balls. I think he's going to be every bit of that 8-1 price. So I don't want to talk you off him at all. And he's shown some ability. I've never been the biggest fan of his turf races, I'll put it that way. But like I said, he's going out for a strong barn, and he's going to be a decent price. I do want to mention some other horses in here, because this is a race that I just do not have a great feel for. And in those types of races, I don't want to lean heavily on the shorter prices. The number 1, Ice Chocolat. I don't know that he's going to be 12-1 with Irad Ortiz aboard. Just feels like a horse like this could take more money. But I will say he showed some improvement towards the end of last year at Woodbine, and I think his return from the layoff at Fairgrounds, just a great example of a horse that got the wrong trip over the Fairgrounds turf course. Go back and watch that race and compare his trip to the one that Anguston got. They were both towards the inside early, but Anguston's rider made the decision to angle him out at the top of the stretch into about the 8 path, and then just ride, the outside portion of that course through the stretch as he was trying to hold on to his lead, whereas Ice Chocolat was kind of, forced to stay inside and rally along that inside rail, which was really not the place to be, especially going all the way back to February at Fairgrounds. And that was a race that had a significant outside flow to it. He just kind of, got stuck in quicksand down towards the inside at the end of that race. So I think he's better than that. His prior turf races arguably aren't quite as good as some others in here, but maybe he's a little better than he looks, and he drew well. So he's one that I would want to use. And then the other horse that I think is very interesting in here is the number 5, Front Run the Fed. And he's one that, maybe is going to be every bit of that 15-1, just given the connections involved. He's just been in a series of impossible spots. I mean, they have gotten very ambitious with this horse. I mean, running in the Grade 1 4-star Dave, the Grade 1 Breeders' Cup Mile, and then shipping out to California last time for that turf sprint. I mean, they've been in some crazy spots with this horse, and he's been gigantic prices. And it just feels like now, coming off the layoff, they're getting more realistic. He's finally in a race that, he seems like he fits a lot better. I like him as a turf sprinter, and he's one that does have a decent late kick, and he's in a race that is supposed to feature more pace. I know he sprinted on turf last time in that Southern California race, but that Joe Hernandez, featured the equivalent of a glacial opening quarter. 22 down the hill is really slow, especially on the turf courses playing as quickly as it was that day. And that was a total merry-go-round race dominated by the leader, Air Force Red. So I just think Front Run the Fed, better than his recent form, makes it look. And I think he's very interesting in this race. I would say his fair odds are, about 7-1, and I think he's going to be a lot higher than that. So he's definitely one that I want to use.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with him that, if you go back to his last 5.5 furlong race, that was a win at Colonial. He did have to work pretty hard to get that win over Grateful Bread, who, I think Grateful Bread would probably be 15-1, 20-1 in this spot. But I think his form is plenty dirtied up. That's for sure. And he's an ex Chad Brown trainee, and these connections aren't going to get bet anywhere near what Chad would get bet if that name was on the past performances. But he's really kind of kept almost the same level of form for this barn as he did for Chad. So I admire the case for that one as well. I couldn't quite get there. I'm going to be leaning more on the 3 and the 6, but he could be making his presence known down the lane.
Yeah, I would even take a look at a horse like the number 8, Mark of the Z, who overall his form is a little inconsistent, but he does seem like a horse that runs his best races at Keeneland. If you isolate those Keeneland turf sprints, they make him a major player in this race. And I know he was facing a really tough field last time off the layoff in the Shaker Town. Maybe that was just the tune-up, and he's going to be fitter for this spot. So he's another one that can do some rallying from off the pace. So this is just the kind of finale where I want to keep an open mind.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of ways to go, and I think your opinion on Beer Can Man, I guess in the context of the whole sequence, kind of shapes where you want to go. I think he's going to be pretty tough, so I'm hesitant to try to include too many other horses with him. But if you get past him, I think there's a lot of different ways to go.
Well, we've done all the handicapping, Michael, and I don't think I've talked to you very much about your personal Pick-5 strategy or how prolific of a Pick-5 player you are. I know you focus on the turf Pick-3 for your analysis that you do for In the Money Media, but Pick-5 strategy, it's a tough thing. And, especially if you're working with a limited bankroll, you really do have to pick your spots. Maybe every sequence isn't one that you can play. And, for me personally, having gone through this sequence, I just view it as a really difficult sequence to put together an affordable play for. I mean, for me, there aren't too many places where I'm looking to just key on one horse or single in this sequence. I mean, there are some favorites that I'm looking to go against, but I have multiple ideas in those races. So for me, it's just hard to pare this down to an affordable play. And I personally don't know if this is a Pick-5 sequence that I'm really going to attack, just given the difficulty level.
Yeah, I think for me, I'll probably put a smaller ticket together that focuses on my longer priced opinions in the races where I think the favorites are vulnerable. And then honing really, really narrow in the races where I think the favorites are going to be tough to beat. So I think generally speaking, you just have to be really cognizant of the type of combinations you're putting together, whether it's just that you're playing to the crowd and putting together the same type of combinations that everybody is. And you just have to make sure that you have those types of separators in the sequence that allow you to get paid when you're right.
I completely agree with that. And this in sequences like this, where, if I'm going to put together an ABC kind of play or do something similar to that method, I mean, the ticket that I'm talking about, or that it's based on my handicapping opinions, is going to get very bloated very fast. So this is the kind of sequence where maybe I'm going to key in on some of those horses that I really like in the sequence, like Rising Empire, and kind of base it around trying to get those horses home, and maybe get a little more creative in those races where some people are going to be inclined to single, like the socially selective race. Maybe I'll use some of those backups around some of the others that I like more in the sequence. So that's the kind of strategy that I might adopt for this one, but it's going to be a tough one to hit. And I think if you're trying to hit the sequence, you're going for a bigger payout, because it does feel like there's the potential for some chaos in here, but it's definitely not easy.
Yeah, so I think the first leg is one of those legs where you could make a case for a lot of runners, and we went through them in almost post position order and made somewhat of a case for a lot. But I would probably try to get through the leg with the 1 Cartographer, the 4 Mr. Keating, the 7 Class Actor, and the 11 Cigarette Boat, and try to, if one of those don't win, I'll be out early and know about it. And then in the second leg, I would want a single socially selective, and be stone cold to that runner, just to limit the amount of combinations and not use combinations that I don't think have much of a chance. In the third leg, I would want to use the 7 House Street and the 10 Tis the Bomb as A's, and then use the other logicals as C's, because I have enough of opinions on price horses in the other legs that I'm willing to have the logicals. If the logicals win, I better be really right in the other legs in order to cash the ticket. And then in the ninth race, I would probably be using the 5 Rattle and Roll and the 7 Tawny Port as A's. I'll throw in Call Me Fast on Your Say So as a C, and then I'll include on your own personal permission, I'll include Skippy Longstocking on combinations just with Tis the Bomb and some of the other prices that I like in the sequence. And then the last leg, I'm going to have a lot of the play running through Beer Can Man, but almost all the combinations will also include the number 6 No Balls, but I'll probably play a higher denomination through Beer Can Man just to try to make sure that I'm accounting for the fact that he's going to be a lower price than the other runner I highlighted, and then use backups like Front Run the Fed, Mark of the Z, and nobody listens. So I think, I'm willing to put a little bit more money into Pick-5 sequences that I've spent a lot of time on. But I want to make sure that there are plenty of combinations within that are available to an outsized payout.
No, and I think the way that you're viewing the sequence and extracting value from it, that's the right way to view it. It's just, it's something that I'm always sensitive to, and it's like a pet peeve of mine when people kind of preach that you can't use a favorite that you don't like. Well, I mean, every sequence is different, and it's dependent on your opinions in the surrounding races. And, when I really like a long shot that I think is adding a lot of value to my sequence that most people are not going to have on their tickets, then I don't want to force myself to be right in some surrounding races to hit this. So, I mean, sometimes you just want to cover that long shot with a win bet. I mean, that's perfectly fine. But, I mean, if you're really tackling this Pick-5 and you want to make something of that opinion, then, you kind of can get into trouble if you try to be right in too many of these legs. And it's tough for people like you or me who make picks in races, and you're kind of forcing yourself when you write out these races and do your analysis to have strong opinions in every race. And when you go to tackle these Pick-5 sequence, that can almost work against you sometimes. You do want to keep more of an open mind, especially if you are creating those value plays in other legs. So just something I wanted to expand upon that we were talking about earlier. Really helpful. I'm not going to, I'll just briefly do what you did, but for me, it's tougher because I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to play this the way that I'm talking about. But that first leg, the maiden race, I would be tempted to use 6 horses, the 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 11. You talked me into throwing Cigarette Boat on there too. I just don't have a strong opinion. I don't want to force myself into that box in that first leg. So if I'm going deep in that race, I'm going to try to force myself into some opinions later. I don't want a single socially selective. I would use the 4 and the 6 Frashado and the Wesley Ward horse as backups. So that's going to kind of, put me down the path of leaning more heavily on horses like Rising Empire and Tawny Port, who I feel pretty good about both of them in the stakes races. And then I could just, really narrow down the backups that I use in those races to maybe just Value Engineering, who I think is very much the other horse in the Elkhorn, and my long shot, Call Me Fast, in the Ben Ally. And then if some of the other horses that I don't like that much beat me in those legs, then so be it. And then the last leg would be another one where I'm looking to spread a little bit more, using some of those prices that I mentioned, like Ice Chocolat, Front Run the Fed, and Mark of the Z, along with the logicals like Smoke and Jay and Beer Can Man. So that's a look at the Pick-5 sequence at Keeneland on Saturday. It's not an easy one, Michael. I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this in quite a bit of detail. Hopefully this was helpful to those that are trying to put together their plays on Saturday themselves. And before I let you go, I just want to give you the chance to kind of tout your stuff and tell people where they can find your opinions or some of the write-ups that you do on the Keeneland Turf Pick-3.
Yeah, so every day that the Turf Pick-3 is offered, which isn't necessarily every day of the Keeneland meet, but this week in particular it has been, I offer up pretty detailed analysis on each leg of the race, as well as I construct tickets using the ABC method that we kind of outlined on this podcast to try to show how to hit that wager. It's a little bit different than this bet because being a $3 minimum versus a 50-cent increment. So it forces you to be really, really narrow on your opinions, and I think it's something that can help get some of the training wheels off when you're doing multi-race bets. That's over on inthemoneypodcast.com. I also post links to it at my Twitter, which is at mdomhokey. So follow me over there for musings on general horse racing topics and some Virginia Tech football as well during the season. So, but I've enjoyed covering that Pick-3 sequence. I really think that it's worth highlighting bets that horse players are clamoring for and supporting them at the windows.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Michael. I really always appreciate you getting your take on the Keeneland meet. Everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these DRF podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Craig will still be off next week for the Pacecast. I'm tentatively planning a little bit of a Kentucky Derby preview episode with maybe a somewhat unexpected guest on the podcast. I'm hoping to, that all holds together. I'm kind of working that out still, but might have a little treat for you coming early next week. So everybody, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next week.